The stars shimmered cold and distant, but the silence of space was broken by a desperate transmission. It was a cry for help, full of static and fear. The human colony on the edge of known space had been attacked by raiders. The people on the ground huddled inside bunkers, children crying, families whispering prayers, waiting for the promised allies who never arrived. Day after day, they scanned the skies for rescue, but all they saw were enemy ships circling above like vultures. The colonists felt forgotten, abandoned by the Interstellar Council, left to die in the ashes of their burning homes. Then one night, the silence shattered as a different kind of fleet tore out of hyperspace. The ships that appeared were not sleek or shining. They were not the proud banners of allied fleets, nor the trusted guardians the colonists had expected. These vessels looked broken, as if time and war had eaten away at them. Their hulls bore scars like open wounds, metal patched with darker alloys, symbols of long-forgotten campaigns still painted in faded colors. Some ships drifted slightly off balance, engines coughing dark trails, but their formation was sharp, controlled, and full of purpose. They were not allies. They were something far older, far harder, humans who had survived 1,000 wars and who had come not for glory but for survival. On the largest of these ships, the Resolute, Captain Daniel Ross stood with arms behind his back. His eyes were calm, steady as he stared at the colony below. Flames licked across the settlement's surface, plumes of smoke curling into the sky. He did not flinch, did not blink, because fire and ruin were sights he had seen too many times before. His crew around him worked in silence, each of them marked by the ghosts of wars past. Faces lined with age and battle weariness, bodies carrying wounds both visible and hidden. These were not soldiers of a fresh army with polished boots and clean uniforms. These were men and women who had nothing left but their ships, their weapons, and the will to fight again. Lieutenant Claire Morgan sat at her station, her eyes scanning tactical readings. A scar traced across her cheek, a reminder of Orion Gate where she had lost her squad years ago. Beside her, an engineer named Lewis grumbled to himself as sparks jumped from a control panel, his hands steady despite the failing system. Every member of the crew carried some story carved into their body or soul. They had no homes to return to. They had no families waiting. All they had was survival, and survival was all they needed. The colonists, watching from below, did not know what to make of these arrivals. To them, the fleet looked like a swarm of ghosts returning from the grave. Hope stirred, but fear grew stronger. Were these ships here to save them? Or were they here to plunder the remains of the colony once the aliens finished their attack? The uncertainty burned in every heart, but one thing was clear. These humans were not ordinary soldiers. They carried themselves like wolves, scarred and merciless, and their presence promised not comfort, but destruction. Daniel Ross turned his head slightly, his voice low but carrying command. "Hold position. Let them see us." His words were measured, and his crew obeyed without question. The Resolute and her sister ships moved into formation, their weapons powering up with a slow, menacing hum. The alien warband orbiting the colony shifted uneasily. They had expected an easy victory, but this fleet of old warships brought with it the weight of history, of unending conflict. Ross's mind wandered for a moment as he studied the burning colony. He thought of the many places he had seen fall, of the countless times he had stood on a bridge watching fire consume a world. Every time allies had promised to come, and every time they had not. His crew had stopped waiting for help long ago. They had learned to live without promises. They had learned to fight without hope, and in doing so, they had become something stronger. Something that no enemy could ever truly understand. Claire broke the silence with a whisper. "They think we're broken." She did not need to explain further. Ross understood. The enemy would look at their battered hulls and patched weapons and see weakness. But weakness had kept them alive, made them adapt, made them ruthless in ways polished armies never could be. Ross nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Then let them come." The fleet hung there, suspended in the black sea of space, like predators watching their prey. The colonists clutched each other, eyes fixed on the strange human ships. To them, these survivors were not saviors. They were something far colder, a force that had outlasted everything else. The transmission that had begged for help was still echoing through the void, but the answer they had received was not what they had prayed for. No allies came, only the merciless survivors of forgotten wars. And as the alien warband shifted closer, preparing to meet this unexpected challenge, Daniel Ross and his crew tightened their formation. They did not come to protect. They did not come to rescue. They had come because survival was in their blood, and war was the only language they spoke. The colony below was just another battlefield, another place where history would repeat itself. And in that moment, the silence of the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to break. Lieutenant Claire Morgan's eyes glowed faintly from the light of her tactical screen. Numbers rolled across it, ship signatures, weapon charges, formation paths of the enemy warband. To anyone else, it was chaos, unreadable and fast, but to her, it was like reading old scars. She had seen this dance before, at Orion Gate, at the fall of Meridian, at battles that the galaxy no longer remembered. Her fingers tapped steady on the console, tracing the enemy's movements as if she already knew their mistakes. Behind her calm face lay memories that would never fade. Firestorms raining on civilian ships, desperate screams fading in broken comms, promises of reinforcements that never came. She had lost everything then, yet she endured like all the others who now manned the survivors' fleet. The ships that formed their ragged line were small in number, but every vessel carried weight far heavier than steel. The Ironheart's hull still bore the outline of plasma burns from a war 30 years ago. The Defiance had mismatched engines bolted on after its originals had been blasted away in another campaign. Even the Resolute's own plating had been replaced so many times that no part of it was younger than the oldest of her crew. These were not ships meant to inspire beauty or hope. They were relics that refused to die, patched again and again, hair filled with men and women who shared the same defiance. The colonists below whispered to each other when their eyes caught the scars painted across those vessels. To them, it looked like a fleet of ghosts, scarred soldiers drifting through space with machines that should not still fly. But the crew inside knew better. Every wound was proof of survival, every scar a story of endurance. No other humans in the galaxy could claim such history, for no one else had lived through what they had. Daniel Ross stood silent, letting his people work. He trusted them, each one sharpened by war until instinct guided them more than orders. They had all seen too much to waste words on doubt. When Claire leaned slightly back and murmured, "They're overconfident," Ross didn't need further explanation. The aliens thought they faced a weak and broken fleet. The survivors had built their whole existence on that illusion. Ross walked slowly across the bridge, the deck groaning under his boots. He looked out through the forward viewport where the alien warband hung against the stars. Sleek cruisers gleamed with untouched armor. The Kark's warriors filled those ships, hungry for destruction, drunk on the power of numbers. Their leader believed the humans below them to be abandoned prey. He did not understand the kind of men and women who waited in silence now. Among the crew, the stories of survival lingered like shadows. Claire remembered holding her squad leader's body as Orion Gate burned. Lewis, the engineer, had been the only survivor when his entire ship had been swallowed by fire during the Battle of Karthus Belt. Even the youngest pilot in their wing, Jacob Harris, had been pulled from the wreckage of his academy ship when his class had been slaughtered in a failed defense. All of them had lost. All of them had been abandoned. And all of them had chosen not to die. That was what set them apart from any other fighting force. They did not fight for orders, not for empires, not for promises of peace. They fought only for each other because no one else would. That bond, born from betrayal and suffering, was stronger than any chain of command. The colonists saw warriors, but in truth, they were a family made in blood and fire. The fleet drifted closer together, a formation tight and deliberate. Their ships were outgunned, their weapons weaker, their armor thinner. Yet the way they moved spoke of discipline, drilled not by training, but by experience carved deep into bone. They did not waste motion. They did not waste energy. Every decision was the product of lessons learned from battles where mistakes meant death. Claire's screen flickered with the first sign of enemy movement. A wing of alien raiders broke formation, testing the humans with a feint. She tilted her head slightly and said, almost as if it were obvious, "They'll try to bait our flank. They'll regret it." Ross's reply was nothing more than a calm nod, but his trust in her words was absolute. She had survived Orion Gate when thousands had not. If she said the enemy would regret it, then they would. The colonists watching from their bunkers began to understand something strange. These were not reinforcements. They were not allies arriving out of duty or obligation. They were survivors who had learned the only way to exist was to fight without mercy. For the first time, fear shifted from the alien invaders to the humans who had just arrived. Because when you looked into their eyes, you saw not hope or salvation, but the cold truth of people who had lost too much to ever go back. The fleet hung in silence, scarred ships against polished ones, ghosts against predators. The enemy still laughed, certain of their advantage. But Claire's quiet voice, Ross's steady gaze, and the scars written across every hull told another story entirely. No allies had come, only survivors, merciless and unbroken, waiting for the battle to begin. General Varkesh stood tall in the command chamber of his flagship, surrounded by the glow of alien holoscreens. His crimson armor shone under the dim lights, every spike and jagged edge designed to strike fear into enemies. He laughed as reports flowed in, showing the ragged human fleet hanging motionless in space. To him, they looked like rusted shells, more wreckage than warships. "Ancient scraps," he growled with amusement, his deep voice echoing. "These humans dare oppose me with floating corpses. This will be quick." His warriors cheered, eager for slaughter, their blades clashing against their armor in a chorus of arrogance. The Kark's armada stretched wide across the stars, rows of cruisers and destroyers gleaming with fresh plating. Their ships had never known true damage. They were symbols of conquest, taken and rebuilt with spoils from countless raids. Every young warrior in that fleet burned with hunger for blood, eager to carve trophies from human bones. They had crushed colonies before, and the humans had always begged before the end. Varkesh expected no different this time. Down on the burning colony, the settlers prayed as they watched the sky. To their desperate eyes, the sleek alien ships seemed like gods of war, and the battered human vessels floating above looked like broken shields. But the colonists did not know who had arrived. They could not imagine the history carved into those war-torn hulls or the kind of people who commanded them. They only knew what they saw, a powerful enemy and a fragile defense. Fear tightened their hearts as alien war drums echoed through comms, promising destruction. Inside the Resolute, Daniel Ross listened to the alien broadcasts. Their voices were confident, mocking, dripping with cruelty. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound sink in, then opened them again with the same calm he always carried. He had heard those same voices 100 times before. Enemies who laughed at his fleet, enemies who thought him broken, enemies who believed they held the advantage. Every time their laughter had ended in silence. Claire Morgan studied the alien formations with unblinking eyes. "They underestimate us," she said quietly, tracing the patterns on her screen. "They always do." Her words carried no pride, no boast, only certainty. She knew the truth better than most. Arrogance was an enemy's greatest weakness, and the Karks were drowning in it. Their movements were too bold, too open, as if this battle was already theirs. That was exactly the mistake she had seen before, and exactly the kind of mistake the survivors had been waiting for. On the lower decks, pilots strapped into fighters so old they rattled when engines warmed. Some traced fingers over scars carved into their cockpits, reminders of battles survived. Engineers checked weapons patched together with parts stolen, salvaged, or built in secret. They all knew their ships were outmatched, yet not one hand shook. They had no illusions, no dreams of glory, only the steady knowledge that survival was built on turning weakness into strength. General Varkesh leaned closer to the view screen, eyes narrowing at the human formation. "Do you see how they cling together?" he sneered. "They know fear. They will break." But the humans did not break. They held their line in silence, weapons charged, waiting. There was no panic, no sign of retreat, only stillness, like wolves crouched low, ready to strike when the prey walked closer. The colonists could not hear the words exchanged on the human bridge, but if they could, they would have realized something chilling. These survivors did not speak of hope. They did not speak of victory. They spoke only of the kill. To them, war was not a duty but a rhythm of life, one they had lived through longer than anyone else. While Varkesh thought of conquest, they thought of the next move, the next strike, the next breath of survival. Alien warriors filled their ships with war cries, preparing for what they thought would be an easy hunt. But behind scarred hulls, human crews sat in silence, their eyes hard, their hearts colder than the void itself. To the Karks, this was another raid, another chance to plunder. To the survivors, this was just another battle in a line of endless wars. And though the aliens did not yet understand it, the outcome was already written in the steel of the survivors' resolve. The first strike came like thunder rolling across the void. Alien cruisers lit the darkness with blazing plasma storms, their weapons vomiting fire that streaked toward the scarred human fleet. Explosions burst like suns around the survivors' ships, fragments scattering into space, but the fleet did not scatter. They moved with eerie calm, their formation bending but never breaking, every maneuver sharp, precise, drilled into their bones by endless battles. To the watching colonists, it looked like madness, fragile vessels holding position against overwhelming force. Yet to the crew, this was nothing new. They had seen worse. They had lived through worse. The Resolute absorbed the brunt of the fire, shields flickering, armor plating glowing under the heat. Captain Daniel Ross stood unmoving, his voice steady as he ordered countermaneuvers. "Cut across their flank," he said, his tone as calm as if he were giving directions in a city street. His words carried no fear, only certainty, and the crew obeyed without hesitation. Engines roared, pulling the Resolute into the heart of enemy fire, daring the aliens to follow. On the tactical deck, Claire Morgan's voice rose above the hum of alarms. "Target the third cruiser, port side. They've stretched too thin." Her hands danced over the console, her eyes locking on the weak point in the alien formation. The ship Valiant responded instantly, breaking formation just enough to swing behind the alien vessel. A hail of kinetic slugs, old but deadly, tore into its engines. The cruiser erupted in fire, splitting apart, its death cry echoing across the comms. Claire's lips curved slightly, not in joy but in grim satisfaction. She had seen this mistake too many times before. The aliens fired harder, their fleet pressing forward with superior numbers. They expected panic, retreat, desperation. Instead, they met a wall of cold discipline. Every human ship moved as if tied by invisible threads, weaving through the storm of plasma, striking back with ruthless precision. These ships were battered, yes, but their gunners had spent years calculating trajectories under worse conditions. Their pilots had flown through fields of wreckage where one wrong move meant death. They did not falter. From the surface of the colony, families huddled together as they watched the battle unfold. Children pressed their faces to cracked windows, gasping as human warships, scarred and burning, still turned predator against prey. The colonists began to realize the truth. These were not reinforcements sent by some council to save them. These were survivors who knew nothing but war, and their presence in the sky was not protection. It was vengeance. The Guardian, one of the smaller warships, dove headlong into the enemy line, its engines howling. Enemy fire ripped across its hull, tearing holes through its plating, but still it pushed forward. With a roar of cannon fire, it shredded an alien gunship before rolling into the shadow of the Resolute, smoke trailing behind it like blood in the water. Its captain's voice came over the comms, harsh but full of fire. "We're not finished yet." The aliens began to realize something was wrong. Their weapons burned, their numbers pressed hard, but for every strike they delivered, the humans answered with something sharper. Where one ship faltered, another filled the gap. Where fire opened wounds in their hulls, they turned and used the wreckage as cover. It was as if the humans had learned to bend defeat itself into a weapon. General Varkesh snarled as another of his ships fell, disbelief creeping into his eyes. "Impossible," he hissed, slamming a clawed hand against his command chair. To him, the battle should have been decided already, but instead it was slipping away. He saw not relics but predators, scarred wolves that had tasted too much blood to ever retreat. Ross watched the enemy line twist under pressure, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "Press them harder. Make them bleed." The survivors' fleet surged forward, battered hulls glowing under enemy fire, weapons blazing with fury drawn from every betrayal, every forgotten battle. The heavens burned with fire, ships exploding like shattered stars, and the colonists on the ground realized they were witnessing something terrifying. These humans were not allies who came to shield them. They were war itself, carried on, scarred hulls and unbroken wills, and nothing the enemy threw at them could make them run. The Guardian's hull split apart, flames spilling into the void as atmosphere vented in a rush of white mist. Crew members were hurled into space, their bodies spinning silently before fading into the black. Yet, even in death, the ship did not surrender. Captain Ethan Clark, his face bloodied from a console blast, stayed strapped into his chair, his voice a growl over comms. "Drive us into them." His remaining crew obeyed without hesitation, forcing the dying vessel forward. With engines screaming, the Guardian slammed into an alien destroyer, tearing through its armor in a blinding explosion that lit the battlefield like a second sun. Both ships were gone, but the message was clear. Humans did not bow, did not bow. They took their enemies with them. On the bridge of the Resolute, Daniel Ross did not flinch as the Guardian vanished from sensors. His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the enemy line. Loss was not new to him. He had buried too many names, seen too many crews vanish in fire to waste grief during battle. To the survivors, death was a companion they had long accepted. What mattered was the price they forced the enemy to pay, and tonight the price would be steep. Claire Morgan's hands moved quickly over her console, her voice steady even as her throat burned with grief for the Guardian's crew. "They've broken their formation," she said, marking targets in red across the display. "We strike now before they recover." Ross gave a single nod, and the fleet responded as one. Scarred vessels lunged forward, guns roaring, the loss of one ship turning into a weapon that broke the alien rhythm. The Valiant surged past the wreckage, weaving between glowing debris, its cannons spitting slugs into another cruiser's hull. The Ironheart, its armor shredded, fired torpedoes at close range, tearing a corvette in half before rolling aside, venting fire from its own wounds. Each ship bled, but none faltered. These were not armies that counted survival by numbers. They counted it by defiance. Down on the colony, the people wept as they watched the Guardian's last blaze, believing it was the end. But when the human fleet surged harder, faster, more merciless, their fear turned to awe. They began to understand. These warriors did not fear death. They had already made peace with it long ago. Every scarred ship in the sky was a testament to that truth. They fought not because they believed they would live, but because they refused to let their enemies walk away unscarred. The aliens, once mocking, began to hesitate. The destruction of the Guardian should have been a victory, yet it shook them. They saw the madness in human eyes, the way they turned loss into fury. They whispered among themselves that these were not soldiers. They were executioners who counted each death as an offering to war itself. Their weapons fired less boldly now, their lines bent under pressure. Ross's voice cut through the bridge like a blade. "Do not give them time to breathe." His order unleashed another storm. The survivors pressed forward, knowing more of their own would fall, but welcoming it as the cost of survival. They had endured 1,000 wars, and in every one they had buried their dead. What terrified the enemy was that the survivors no longer feared joining them. Claire leaned closer to her screen, her eyes catching the weakening signals of 2 more alien cruisers. "They're bleeding," she whispered, almost to herself. It was not triumph in her voice, only the cold recognition of inevitability. For the survivors, victory was never glorious. It was only survival stretched one more day. In the shadow of burning wrecks, the colonists realized something terrifying yet undeniable. The people who had come to their skies were not protectors, not allies, not saviors. They were the merciless survivors of forgotten wars, and their only purpose was to endure, no matter how much blood it cost. The Guardian's sacrifice was not a tragedy to them. It was the rhythm of their existence, the heartbeat of endless war. And now that rhythm thundered louder than ever in the void. Rumors spread like smoke through the alien fleet. The humans they faced were not soldiers bound by empires or councils, but remnants of something older, darker. Raiders whispered across comm channels, voices strained, calling them deathless ghosts who turned wreckage into weapons. Some claimed to see the faces of their own fallen reflected in the firelight of human ships, as if the dead themselves had returned. Fear crept where arrogance had once lived, gnawing at discipline, loosening formations. On the surface, the colonists peered from shelters, their eyes wide as scarred warriors walked among them during brief resupply. These soldiers did not move like men on a mission of hope. They carried themselves like shadows, silent and watchful, every step heavy with memory. A child reached out to one of them, a little boy no older than 7, tears streaking his face as he whispered, "Will you save us?" The warrior, a woman with a missing arm replaced by crude metal, crouched low. Her gaze was distant, hollow, but she placed a hand on his shoulder and said only, "We'll make them bleed." The boy did not understand, but his parents did, and they trembled. Claire Morgan, reviewing tactical updates aboard the Resolute, leaned back in her chair. Her eyes carried exhaustion, but they burned with a quiet fire. She had been in too many places where cries for help went unanswered, where allies never came. That was why they never called themselves protectors. They knew the truth. Those who survived did so because they were willing to be merciless. When she looked at the colony below, she did not see people to defend. She saw witnesses who would learn what survival truly meant. Daniel Ross stood at the viewport, his reflection split by cracks in the glass shielding. His crew's silence pressed around him. They had seen their own captain carry bodies to airlocks, had heard his orders spoken over the cries of dying men. Yet his voice never shook, not once. To them, Ross was not a leader in the traditional sense. He was an anchor, the unyielding center of their endless storm. And now, as alien fleets regrouped for another push, he remained unmoved, as if death itself was just another adversary to outlast. The Kark's warriors tried to bolster their courage. General Varkish broadcast messages of strength, mocking human scars, declaring them weak and finished. But his soldiers heard another sound behind his words: hesitation. The humans had planted doubt, and doubt was poison in battle. Their opponents were no longer trophies waiting to be claimed. They were predators who welcomed pain and turned sacrifice into blades. The colonists began to whisper a new name for their unexpected defenders: the merciless. They could not call them heroes, for nothing in their eyes shone with heroism. They could not call them saviors, for their presence was too cold, too brutal, but merciless. They understood that. The colonists saw in those warriors the embodiment of survival stripped bare, and though they prayed for salvation, they feared the very hands that might deliver it. Claire overheard the whispers on open comm channels. Fear, awe, gratitude, dread. It mixed together until she could no longer tell them apart. She closed her eyes and let out a slow breath. This was always how it ended. Those they fought for never thanked them, never wanted them. They were tolerated only in moments of desperation, then cast aside when peace returned. But peace never lasted, and so the survivors never stopped. In the silence before the next battle wave, the crew of the survivors' fleet prepared without a word. Pilots strapped in, gunners checked their weapons, engineers patched holes with shaking hands but steady focus. They had lived through too many wars to question why they still fought. Each one carried ghosts, but the ghosts did not weigh them down. They pushed them forward. And out in the void, the aliens watched these scarred ships reposition with grim resolve. It was then that true fear set in, for they realized they were not facing men and women who hoped to live. They were facing those who had already accepted death, and that made them unstoppable. General Varkesh stood at the center of his command deck, claws digging into the metal railing as sparks from damaged consoles rained around him. His ships, once a flawless wall of power, now looked fractured. Cruisers limped, gunships sputtered smoke, and the air in his chamber was thick with the stench of fear. He bared his fangs and snarled, "Form up! Crush them now! We end this!" His voice carried fury. But the warriors around him knew the truth. His certainty was bleeding away. Across the void, the survivors' fleet shifted into a formation that seemed more ritual than strategy. Each battered warship aligned with grim symmetry, their hulls glowing with fire and wounds yet refusing to fall. On the Resolute's bridge, Daniel Ross gave the order without hesitation. Forward. No hesitation. His tone was like stone breaking water, unshaken, final. Engines roared, the survivors' ships surging toward the alien line, with the weight of 1,000 forgotten wars pressing behind them. The Valiant led the charge, shields sparking, its cannons firing with relentless rhythm. It tore through the flank of an alien destroyer, flames blossoming as the vessel broke in two. The Ironheart plunged straight into enemy fire, rolling through plasma bursts and responding with torpedoes that detonated across another cruiser's spine. Every survivor knew they might not return, yet no voice wavered. Sacrifice was not a tragedy here, it was expectation. Claire Morgan's tactical station flickered with alerts, the console shuddering under strain. She steadied herself with one hand and called out the weaknesses she saw, her voice carrying across the bridge like a steady drumbeat. Second carrier on the left. Engines vulnerable. Strike now. Ross didn't question. He trusted her eyes, sharpened by endless battlefields where hesitation had killed others. Varkesh's flagship answered the charge with everything it had, plasma cannons blazing, missile swarms blotting out the stars. But the survivors wove through the fire like shadows, each ship moving as if part of the same body. One vessel was struck, splitting open, but even as it burned, its last act was to unleash a final barrage that tore into the flagship's hull. To the survivors, death without delivering pain was unthinkable. The colonists on the surface huddled together, their shelters trembling from the shockwaves above. They had prayed for rescue. Yet what they witnessed was something beyond salvation. The humans in the sky were not defending, they were consuming, breaking the enemy apart piece by piece with cold resolve. The colonists wept, torn between terror and awe, realizing that the survivors fought not for them, but because it was all they knew how to do. Inside the alien flagship, panic began to bloom. Varkesh's officers shouted conflicting orders, their once proud discipline collapsing. Warriors who had been promised easy victory now trembled, their courage drowned by the sight of merciless humans who turned even death into a weapon. Varkesh roared, striking one of his officers down, but even his fury could not hold the cracks together. The Resolute cut across the flagship's path, its cannons blazing. Ross's gaze fixed on the towering vessel, unblinking. "End this," he said softly, and his fleet obeyed. Coordinated strikes tore into the flagship's engines, its hull groaning as fire spread across its decks. Explosions rippled along its spine, and the ship shuddered like a beast struck at its heart. Claire's screen lit up with warning signals as the enemy's power core destabilized. She whispered under her breath, "It's over." Her voice carried no triumph, only the weariness of someone who had watched too many endings to celebrate another. In the final moments, as the alien flagship tore itself apart, Varkesh's bellow of rage echoed into silence. The Kark's armada collapsed with him, their confidence broken, their strength shattered by relics they had mocked. The survivors' fleet floated in the wreckage, scarred, burning, yet still alive, because survival was the only victory they had ever claimed. The battlefield quieted, wreckage drifting like a graveyard across the stars. Alien ships burned in silence, their twisted frames casting faint light across the colony's sky. The survivors' fleet held position, scarred hulls glowing, smoke venting from broken seams. To any other navy, this would have been the moment for celebration, for cheers of victory. But no sound rose from those ships. The men and women aboard carried no joy, only the familiar weight of surviving one more war. On the bridge of the Resolute, Daniel Ross stood in the dim glow of failing consoles. His crew worked quietly, patching wounds, counting the dead, preparing for the next move. There was no talk of medals or glory, only the cold efficiency of people who had been here too many times before. Ross stared at the colony below, its surface scarred by fire and battle. For a moment, he wondered if the people would ever truly understand what had stood in their skies that night. Then he turned away, because wondering did not matter. Survival mattered. Nothing else. Claire Morgan leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing for a brief second. She could still hear the cries from Orion Gate in her mind, still see the firestorm swallowing ships whole. This battle was no different, only another entry in the endless cycle. Her console beeped, pulling her back, and she steadied herself. She would keep fighting because there was nothing else left for her. Like the others, she was bound to the fleet not by duty, but by the simple truth that they had nowhere else to go. Down on the colony, survivors gathered in the open, staring upward at the scarred ships. Children pointed with wide eyes, some whispering that the merciless fleet had saved them. Parents, though, spoke in hushed tones, voices edged with fear. They had been spared, but not protected. They had seen the faces of the warriors who fought for them, and those faces had not carried kindness. The colonists knew they were alive not because they were worth saving, but because the survivors would not let themselves be broken. Gratitude mixed uneasily with dread. When the last of the enemy wrecks faded into the dark, the fleet began to move. No speeches were given, no promises made. Engines flared, guiding the battered vessels back into the endless void. The colonists shouted their thanks across comms, desperate to believe someone had fought for them. But the survivors did not answer. To them, the colony was already forgotten, just another battlefield left behind. On the deck of the Resolute, Ross gave the final order with the same calm as always. Set course. We don't linger. His crew obeyed instantly, their discipline shaped by the understanding that peace had no place for them. They were wanderers bound to war, carrying scars like banners, carrying ghosts heavier than steel. As the survivors vanished into hyperspace, silence returned to the galaxy's edge. The colonists whispered stories of the merciless fleet, tales of shadows who had come when no allies answered. Some would call them saviors, others monsters, but all would remember the truth, burned into the stars. No allies had come, only the merciless survivors of 1,000 wars, leaving nothing behind but fear, awe, and the memory of what survival truly costs.